Okay, we're here just a few minutes early. I wanted to go ahead and show everyone, and I'll paste the link in the chat so everybody can find it. This diagram that I created, and I'm going to navigate over to my desktop to show you. Window. Let's see if it's up.
Okay. This diagram shows us the relationship. Not this only depicts chapters 1 and 2 that we did yesterday. So this is a diagram that you can show relationships with. You can show connections to. So you're going to hear some of these same people today that we went over yesterday. Major General William Wild Bill Donovan, and he's basically connected to the World Commerce Corporation, FDR. That's his wife. Um, one of the mob bosses, Paul Helliwell, that we talked about, and of course he worked for the OSS, follow on CIA. Numerous examples. So if you want to look at this, the only thing I ask is use the plus and minus and kind of navigate around, but try not to click on any of these actual um, symbols because you can inadvertently edit it. It's public. I can't place a lock on it. It's just there for us to use. So I just ask that you not make any changes to it. So when you look at this one here, this is the CIA and the precursor OSS. So these are all of the people, many of which we talked about yesterday, that's all connected to the CIA. Just about every industrialist, every celebrity, the CIA has worked with in the past. The mob boss, Lucky Luciano, the organization Operation Gladio, that Galen actually created, passed off, and allowed the CIA to use. Castle Bank was part of the banking system set up along with the Vatican Bank, which we will add after today's lesson. So I just wanted to let y'all know that that was there and available. The link is in the chat. You can um, use it at your will. Okay, let's navigate back over to the live stream, and were y'all able to see that? It looks like my frame here is frozen. This is a problem that we had yesterday. So let me type in here. Use the link to illustrate all the connections. Okay. So today we're going to start with the Vatican alliance with Operation Gladio. And again, I'm going to preface this with a couple of warnings that we talked about yesterday. We're here for the truth. We're not here to hold people's hands. We are going to find that just about every institution, every government organization has had elements that, and it does not speak to the entirety of an organization. They have had elements that have been involved in this global alliance that I refer to as the international syndicate. So I just ask that everybody listens with an open mind, take the information and do your own research. That's the most important part of this, is doing your own research. So we're going to start off with a quote that was found in Forbes in 2012. The Institute for Works of Religion, which is referred to as the IOR, we're going to refer to it as the Vatican Bank because it's easier. But I wanted everyone to know that if you ever see the words Institute for Works of Religion, IOR, it is referring to the Vatican Bank. It says in the article, it is a privately held financial institution located inside the Vatican City. It's founded in 1942. The IOR's role is to safeguard and administer properly intended for works of religion or charity. The bank accepts deposits only from top church officials and entities, according to Italian legal scholar Maio Caridi. I'm going to butcher these names today, guys, because there's a lot of Italian people whose names are very difficult to pronounce. Probably the only ones worse are the German names. Other entities, according to Italian legal scholar Settimo Paradi, it is ran by a president, but overseen by 5 cardinals who report directly to the Vatican and the Vatican Secretary of State. Because so little is known about the bank's daily operations and transactions, it has often been called the most secretive bank in the world. Now, what's interesting is and I also part of this whole thing is teaching other people to do research and things that should stick out to them. So immediately when I see the date 1942, the first thing that I think of is that in the middle of World War II. I think it's odd that you would create a bank in the middle of the war, but that's just me. There are a few other dates that's going to stick out to you as we go through this. So it was created by Pope Pius XII and a guy by the name of Bernardino Nogara on June 27th, 1942. Now, I would also suggest that y'all look up this guy on your own, this Nogara, because one of the things that you immediately find is that he was the financial advisor. He served in this role from 1929, and again, dates. So the bank was established in 1942, but this guy was hired by the Vatican in 1929. And he stayed there in that capacity until 1954. He was retained by several popes during this process. Nogara's career, he had the ability to float around circles of industry and politics under the guise of being an envoy of the church in this capacity that he was the financial advisor to the church. There's a laundry list of companies that this guy either was employed by or served on the boards of. He also had the ability to appoint board members on behalf of the church. So he was a very influential guy, very, very influential. So also it was noted that he made many investments that were not consistent with the Catholic faith. And he made direct loans to the Mussolini government. He was there when Mussolini and under the king of Italy made the agreement with the church finally, because evidently from the late 1800s there was an argument over when all of Italy grouped together to become the country of Italy, that the country basically took the land from the Catholic Church. And so they had this official disagreement for decades. The disagreement was rectified through negotiations of the church and Mussolini. And it was done at a critical time in the history of the church, because at that time, the church was basically broke. And this guy had been the financial administrator for about 15 years before this occurred. So where'd all their money go in that 15 years? That they're almost basically broke. They have to go to Mussolini of all people, to basically come to an agreement of the papal states and become their own entity, with some other various agreements made as part of this treaty. Um, but a huge influx of money went to the church as a result of supposedly Italy taking their land. And I'm not saying that they didn't. I'm just saying that was the whole argument among them. So he's a very interesting guy, and he sat on all kinds of boards, to include pharmaceuticals. And he did all of this under the auspices of the church. And a lot of his investments would seem completely contrary to the church's mission, to include buying up a whole bunch of property in the United States after the Wall Street crash. And he seemed, because of the circles that he floated around in, to know exactly what companies ahead of time to invest in before either the bottom fell out to get out of them, or before some announcement was made that um, in one of the cases, it was an insurance company that was going to pick up a whole bunch of business. He seemed to know ahead of time and then bought a bunch of shares on behalf of the church there. So just a very interesting guy. I'll just leave it at that. So I encourage you to do your own homework on him, because there's some interesting timing things that are relating to him. Okay, back to the book. So he becomes the steward, president, however you want to refer to him, of the Vatican Bank. And in doing this, I'm going to put my glasses on here for just a second. What's interesting about this is while it says there's this council and it's under the Secretary of State, this guy did not deal with any of those people. He reported directly to the Pope. And we all know that the Vatican is a sovereign entity, that they don't report in any way to Italy. So this becomes important when you're dealing with a bank, because there's no way to redress any wrongdoings of the bank if they were caught embezzling or anything else. They are completely secret. Not even the most egregious violations of international law can be addressed, nor can it be forced to release the source of any deposit. The bank resides under the direct jurisdiction of the Pope. He owns it, he controls it. The Swiss guards are stationed at the entrance of the bank to guard it. And again, you have to put associations together. We've all been told that the Swiss guards guard the entire Vatican. I find that extremely interesting. And you can make the argument that it's because Switzerland is quote unquote neutral, but we've already proven the fact that they are not neutral at all. So I find it interesting that a significant amount of banks doing money laundering is located in Switzerland, number one. It was also the only place up until not that long ago where you could have numbered accounts, complete anonymity, and where the Bank of International Settlements is, where the WEF meets. So there seems to be a lot of globalization going on in Switzerland. So Nogara, who became the first president of the Vatican Bank, initiated a process of destroying all records of the bank transactions, including deposits, investments, on a regular basis, so that none of its operations were free and clear for public or private scrutiny. Now, anybody trashing documents is always suspect in my book. So then it talks about there are 3 separate and distinct boards of directors of the bank. One board consists of high-ranking cardinals, one board of international bankers, and a third one of Vatican financial officials. But even these records cannot be subpoenaed for inspection. The confidential documents of the sovereign state that can only be examined by a special permission and only directly from the Pope. Not even the bank president, this guy, can release the documents, only the Pope. The Holy See dutifully publishes all kinds of financial reports, but not a single one of them list the Vatican Bank at all. If it even mentions the initials IOR, it's this. They contain meticulous records of incomes and expenditures of every agency within the Holy See except the IOR. And that except the IOR will be listed on all of these. For example, the name of this agency is never seen on a single balance sheet. From all published reports, this entity is non existent in the church. So it uses phrases exempting the Vatican Bank or IOR from any ruling or standard of protocol. There are phrases such as, quote, always leaving intact the special character of the IOR, unquote. Another quote, not including the IOR, quote, another quote, with respects to the jurisdictional status of the IOR, unquote. So every financial document that is written has nothing to do with the Vatican Bank. So everybody needs to understand that. It is completely secret. Because of these clandestine workings, millions can be deposited into the IOR on a continuous basis and channeled into numbered Swiss bank accounts without the possibility of detection. This is the perfect place for anybody doing nefarious business. According to MoneyVow, which is an anti-money laundering committee of the Council of Europe, it remains one of the world's leading launderers for dirty cash under Pope Francis. In 1947, Pope Pius XII was more than willing to allow black money to flow through his bank. The Truman administration already had funneled more than $350 million to the Holy See for economic relief and political payments. The Pope used these funds to reactivate the Christian Democratic Party, which had been dismantled under the reign of Mussolini. And there was additional money. Another 30 million flowed in from Truman Aids to create the Catholic Action, which is a nonprofit organization that was dedicated to propaganda against the communists. Now, we're going to see throughout these two chapters that the communists are used as the target to be able to justify the poisoning of Americans with drugs, as it was in our last chapter, and every single divisive thing that the CIA or anybody wants to do. It is always done in the name of anti-communism, but we have shown that these same people are as invested in communistic activity as anybody else. American Cardinal Francis Spillman was now called upon to spearhead the Vatican-sponsored campaign to encourage Italian Americans to urge their relatives in the old country to vote against the communists, and it names a few of them. The fate of Italy depends on the forthcoming election and the conflict between communism and Christianity. Between slavery and freedom, Spillman wrote in a pamphlet that had been distributed to all the parishes in the United States. The cardinal also arranged to bombard Italy with radio messages from American celebrities such as Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and Gary Cooper, urging everyone to register as a Christian Democrat. That's hard to even say. But what's interesting is the Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, those guys all worked basically for the mafia. In all of the nightclubs throughout America where these people sang, they went down to Cuba when that was owned by the mafia. So I guess they definitely got used a lot by multiple different people. So Pope Pius XII soon realized he would need many more millions of dollars from Uncle Sam, since 50% of the Italian people were now aligned with the Communist Party that was registered in Italy in the upcoming elections. He was no stranger to U.S. intelligence agents. At the close of the war, the Pope, along with Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, his Undersecretary of State, had worked with Dulles and the OSS to create the rat lines that were used to help Nazis escape Europe, something he was he viewed as an essential means to address the threat of communism. And that has to do with the stay behind units and creating them. They wanted to preserve the Nazis because they felt that they were an adequate fighting force and deterrent against the spread of communism. Several prominent Nazis, including Walter Roth, who had led an extermination unit of the SS across Italy, still remained sheltered in Vatican City, ready to join in the struggle against the Red Menace. In 1945, the Pope had held private audiences with Wild Bill Donovan to discuss the implementation of Gladio and to decorate him as a crusader against communism. And Wild Bill Donovan, while he's still a military two-star general, was awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of Saint Sylvester, the oldest and most prestigious papal knighthood. So, in the months that followed 1948 national election, the CIA before, sorry, in the months before the 48 national election, CIA dumped $65 million of black money into the Vatican Bank. Much of the cash was handed in large suitcases to members of Lucky Luciano's syndicate, including clerics with affiliates with the Sicilian mafia. This money was used to buy votes. One reason for the secrecy, Cardinal Francis Spillman of New York later revealed, was that subversive groups in the US would grasp that this is a very effective pretense for attacking the US government for having released money to the Vatican, even though it was indirectly conveyed. The heroin, which remained the source of all of this money, continued to be supplied by the Sicilian mob and the pharmaceutical company that was, we talked about yesterday, that was putting them in fake oranges. They put them inside of chocolates in a candy company. And they used all kinds of different mechanisms to disguise the heroin being transported into Cuba for refinery and then into the United States. And we also talked about yesterday the Cubans Santo Trafficani and his family continuing to cut the heroin with sugar while it was delivered to New Orleans, Miami, and New York. The CIA established protected drug routes into these ports by developing close ties with the mafia affiliated International Longshoremen Association, as well as Jimmy Hoffa's International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Now, I will just share with you this information. My dad drove a truck, and he was a Teamster for a very long time until he went independent and the deregulation of the trucking industry. There were places my dad refused to drive his truck into because they knew within the truck driver industry that you would be transporting drugs. If your trip began in New York, or excuse me, in New Orleans or Miami, and your destination was New York City, you were transporting drugs. That was a well-known fact. My dad told me many, many stories about friends of his, that one guy who lived here in Lakeland got caught and had drugs on his truck. But there was a number that they were provided by the union to call because they had points of contact in, and I'm going to illustrate that in just a second. The name of the organization before it was the FBI or the current ATF, whatever, was called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, BNDD. So this activity was not lost on a guy by the name of Harry Anslinger, who was the head of that organization, who noted the sharp rise in the supply of heroin into the African American communities and subsequent rise in addiction. Hearing from informants that the drugs were coming from Luciano, he sent one of his guys to Sicily, where they were ordered to haunt and the deported gangster every move. And it wasn't long before the agents caught Luciano with a half ton of heroin being ready for shipment to Havana. So this guy pressed for an arrest, but no action was taken by the Italian government or by the US State Department. It was as if Luciano's work was sanctioned by both. And he was told that it was a matter of national security, not the um, citizens of the United States security, the national security of the government and the gangsters that were involved in the drug trafficking, primarily out of the CIA. So, as we got to closer to the elections, hundreds of mafia-made men began to arrive in Italy from New York, Chicago, Miami to aid Luciano and Del Collo in addressing the communist problem. The CIA black money or mob muscle was paid out by the Vatican Bank and by the organization called Catholic Action. In this way, the Holy See forged an alliance with the Sicilian mafia. The force of the mafia was now unleashed upon the Italian electorate. Don Carlo and an army of thugs, including Vito Genevieve's cousin Giovanni Genovese, burned down 11 communist branch offices, made 4 assassination attempts on the communist leader. The gang under Frank Coppola, who had been imported from Detroit by Angleton, a CIA guy, to work with the Sicilian bandit Salvatore Giuliano. Also opened fire on a crowd of workers celebrating May Day in Portella della Ginestra, killing 11 and wounding 57. The funds for the massacre was provided by Wild Bill Donovan through his World Commerce Corporation. So the Italian leading labor organizer, a guy by the last name of Rosado, was found dead at the bottom of a cliff, his legs and arms chained and a bullet through his brain. Throughout 1948, in Sicily alone, the CIA-backed terror attacks resulted in the killing of an average of 5 people per week. Crazy, crazy, crazy. So we go on to find out that, and I'm going to butcher this guy's name too, Monsignor Don Giuseppe Beccarari, acting upon papal authority, assembled a terror gang charged with the task of beating up communist candidates. And let me just say this at this point. I say this knowing in several other books that have discussed Operation Gladio, I don't believe that the emphasis that this author is putting on the Catholic Church, I'm not saying they weren't involved because they're the perfect cover for money laundering. But I am going to say that the whole reason for Operation Gladio, as it was discussed between Alan Dulles and the German Galen, who created the thing, because remember yesterday we were talking about them originally being referred to as werewolves. Their entire operation was to create terror in a country using these underground organized entities so they could literally get the population of these countries to do anything they wanted. And they always used communism as the bully pulpit. So I honestly believe while this guy focuses a lot in the next couple of chapters on the role of the Catholic Church, and they certainly had a role, I want everybody to keep in mind this organization and these people that are involved in it were always originally created as a means for Germany to be able to remote control countries from the inside using what they refer to as Operation Gladio or stay behind units. They can manipulate countries to do anything when the people inside those countries are terrified and the politicians know that if they go against what they are being told they need to do, they will be murdered by these people. It's a big controlling mechanism. So this guy, on election day, Don Carlo and his men stuffed ballot boxes and bribed voters with freshly laundered money, drug money. That sounds familiar. I would also suggest to you that America has quite a few of these stay behind units here. And I believe they do things like, oh, well, they're actually fascist. So we're going to label them anti fascist and pretend like they're not and see how many gullible people will believe it. The same thing with BLM. They have used these people in these stay behind units throughout the United States. The group that they found down in Atlanta, another good example. They got arms, they had explosives. That sounds like a stay behind unit. Okay. Christian Democrats triumphantly returned to power as a result of all of this terror. In his memoirs, William Colby, who would later become the director of the CIA, wrote that the communists would have gained 60% of the vote without the agency's sabotage. So you have the CIA director involved in terror cells throughout the state of Italy, manipulating their elections, good or bad, on behalf of the American government, and he got the money to do it by drugging Americans. Just let that sink in for a second. 1 year after the elections, renewed fears, because of course, once you get a boogeyman, you can't ever let him die. Renewed fears of a communist takeover in Italy arose from Stalin's creation of a Council for Mutual Economic Assistance that created an economic union between the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania to enforce the Soviet domination of the lesser states of Central America or Central Europe. Now, again, we're going to go back to our previous book and point out that Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania are all the targets of Germany. Germany tried to take every one of those. Germany creates stay behind units and now says that if these states that they want to dominate goes into an economic union against the Soviet Union, we're going to use that to get more CIA funds were deposited in the members of Don Carlo's crime family in the Catholic banks throughout Italy, including Banco Ambrosiano. These banks, thanks to the Lateran Treaty, which is the treaty I was just talking about at the beginning of the show, which established Vatican City as a sovereign state, were safe from the scrutiny of the Bank of Italy or any Treasury Department. So what this says basically, and the bank directors were all priests. So what this is saying is there were satellite offices, so to speak, of the Vatican Bank throughout throughout the country of Italy that had priests in charge of banks that furthered the network of the bank, the Vatican Bank. In 1949, Pope Pius XII issued a solemn decree which excommunicated not only the members of the Holy Mother Church who joined or favored the Communist Party, but also all Catholics who read, published, or disseminated any printed material that upheld communist ideology. That's quite a statement. No free speech for you. Fearful that the decree, and they do this all in the name of Christianity. That just blows my mind. Fearful that the decree might be insufficient to crush the forces of godlessness, Pius XII continued to tighten his ties with the CIA into a Gordian knot that no one could unravel. The Christian Democrat Party continued to receive more than $20 million in annual aid from the CIA, and in return, the CIA established a Vatican desk under Angleton at the CIA. So there was going to be a Vatican desk officer inside the CIA. The Vatican desk reviewed all intelligence reports that was sent into the Holy See from papal diplomats who were stationed behind the Iron Curtain. So they're using the church and the diplomat immunity of Catholic priests to feed intelligence to the West. During the early years of the Cold War, this became one of the only means for the CIA to penetrate the Eastern Bloc. Strategies between the CIA and the church were drafted to undermine the communist movements throughout Europe and South America. So, again, my translation of that is they are using these stay behind cells under the threat of communism to embed them in all of these countries in Europe and South America for political manipulation. That's the way I read that. Angleton swore his allegiance to the Holy Mother Church and became a knight of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. The legendary ecclesiastical society dating back to the Crusades. Other spooks were also knighted, including William Casey, William Colby, John McCone, who were all future CIA directors. Yikes. That's almost like that was a requirement. General Vernon Walters, who would become the deputy director of the CIA under George Bush Sr., Albert Carone, CIA agent William Buckley, who we know became the owner of the National Review, Frank Shakespeare, the director of the CIA media outlets Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, excuse me, NATO General and future Secretary of State Alexander Haig, and Wild Bill Donovan. So I guess he got 2 knighthoods. He must be really special. Also knighted under this particular one was General Reinhard Gehlen, the guy who created the stay behind units, who was Hitler's intelligence chief. Now, I'm sorry, but if you're bestowing the chief of Hitler's intelligence chief with a special military order of Malta, and you're giving that same award to basically our entire staff of the original CIA and many iterations to come, that tells me they're all in bed together. But that's just me. In 1945, Galen had been asked by the OSS, and see, this is just absolutely not true. This author says that Galen had been asked by the OSS to step up stay behind units made up of fellow Nazis to spy on the Soviet Union. He wasn't asked to step them up or set them up. He set them up. It was Galen's organization to begin with. And it says he even acknowledges known as the Galen organization because he's using a distinction between these stay behind units and the werewolf units. They are exactly the same. And Galen had them all set up as early as 1942, before the war was even over. Much of the business between the CIA and the Vatican began to be conducted at annual meetings of that special military order of Malta. See, that's what they do with these secret societies like this particular thing. They use those meetings and to plan operational activities. So you give this award to all of these people that you want working on the stay behind Operation Gladio. Then when they have meetings and plan Operation Gladio, they're doing it under some fraternity that's completely innocent because it's part of the Catholic Church. Not. Cardinal Francis Spillman presided over the proceedings and sanctioned future strategies against communist forces in Europe in the name of the Pope. So basically, Spillman was in charge of those annual meetings. Since the Vatican played an essential part of Gladio, William Colby, the CIA station chief in Rome, had microphones planted throughout the papal apartment so the agency could monitor the Pope's conversation with his staff. That snooping, and he's got a reference here, continued until 1984. That's very interesting. The Vatican now became a principal depository not only for Black funds, but also secret documents, including CIA files. Oh, I bet they got some of Joe Biden files there too, relating to the development of nuclear weapons. Wait, what? We have nuclear weapons documentation and files at the Vatican, and they wonder how all of these other countries got nuclear weapons. Hmm. These files, never declassified, surfaced in 2006 during the process of discovery in a lawsuit, Alperin versus Vatican Bank, a class action suit by Holocaust survivors who claimed that the Vatican Bank was the repository of gold that had been stolen from them by the Nazi Croatian government. Oh, and isn't that interesting when we also are told that discovery in these lawsuits produces all kinds of evidence? That's interesting. So they refer to, again, Galen's plan, which they refer to in this book as Helliwell's plan, but keep in mind it's a German plan, had been implemented throughout Italy. The Italian pharmaceutical could no longer meet the agency's increased demand for heroin. So the pharmaceutical giant was extended to the limit by producing annual shipments of 200 kilos to the labs that Luciano and Don Carlo shipped them off to. So the CIA would have to establish their own drug routes in order to meet the current needs and also to develop new markets for new targeted populations. So they also, because they were using a pharmaceutical lab that had certain expertise, there was not a lot of trained scientists cutting raw opium and heroin for the um, the drug market that they had created. So they basically had to set up a new complete operation or risk losing the Cold War. So we go on to talk about in chapter 4, which will be our last chapter today, about the drug network that they set up. So outside of Italy, the second best place to process the opium into heroin was in France because of the Corsican mafia. So you have the Sicilian mafia and you have the Corsican mafia, and they had perfected because, and this is very interesting, which you'll see the connection immediately. They had been in the drug trade for a very long time because of their presence in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Now you know the real reason the French was in Vietnam. And now you know the real reason when they got kicked out because the Vietnamese was sick of them poisoning their population with drugs and them growing drugs where they could be growing food, and they finally kick out the French. Now you know why the CIA was desperate to get us in there. They wanted control over that drug trade. There's no other reason why we were in Vietnam. Just saying that out loud. The Luciana's syndicate sorely needed the talents that the Corsicans had created in the new narcotics network. But the labor unions in Marseille, where the heroin labs were located, had a lot of union workers, which supposedly were controlled by communists. So they refused to load and unload ships coming from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. What's interesting is there could be no national, like protection or concern for people. It had to be labeled a communist activity and not a nationalist activity. Again, they're just using the communists as a cloaking device to take out anybody that they don't want in their way. So they talk about a little bit about them kicking the French out of Vietnam, and that supposedly there's this big communist threat, and that the communists have infiltrated all of the labor unions, And they use that as an excuse to basically become strike breakers. So, to break the strike, Lucky Luciano made contact with Antone and Bartholomew, I'm going to butcher this one too, Gariini, the leaders of the Corsican mafia, who initiated a series of attacks against the strikers and labor leaders. The attacks, funded by the CIA, continued until 1950 when they finally gained complete control of the waterfront. CIA operative Thomas Braden later recalled how he had dealt with this situation. And what he says here's a little confusing. So basically, I'm going to translate it. The CIA guy, Thomas Braden, who used the name Warren Haskins when he was doing this operation, gave a guy by the name of Irving Brown, which was not his real name, his name was Norris Gambo, $15,000 from the CIA to destroy the strike so they could continue their drug operations. And he admitted it. There's a paper with him actually signing that. Thanks to the CIA assistance, Marseille now became the new center of the heroin industry. By 1951, only months after the Corsican and Sicilian mafia took control of the waterfront, they had recruited a host of French chemists and opened their first opium refineries in France. Production was one problem, supply was another. The new heroin network needed services of a narcotics broker. The leading opium broker within the plains of Turkey was a guy by the name of Sami El Khoury, a slick Syrian opium merchant who had become the leading supplier of opium paste to the Middle East. Lucky Luciano met with him as soon as the strike was settled, created a business relationship, and immediately began flowing millions of kilos of raw opium from Turkey to Beirut, Lebanon. That's amazing. Because you fast forward to Beirut, Lebanon, and all of the problems that it's had, that our military's been involved in, knowing that the CIA was all over that place, this stuff just pisses you off. Where it has been manufactured into a morphine base, the Turkish guy secured the route by paying off Lebanese police and custom agents with Luciano's cash. From Lebanon to Marseille, from the French port of the heroin was shipped on freighters to Cuba under the protection of CIA. So throughout his career, the Turkish guy, El Khoury, remained under the care and protection of the CIA. And then they list multiple drug busts, both in the United States and outside the United States, where this guy was either involved, arrested, detained, and every single one of them was thwarted in either prosecuting him or even retaining him. So this one guy who is had a 30-year career in the Drug Enforcement Administration, that's the name I was trying to think of earlier, said, the major targets of all of my major investigations almost invariably turned out to be working for the CIA. Let that sink in. So why exactly do we have a drug enforcement organization? We have one because you have to pretend like you're actually doing something. So the DEA is there to pretend like they're actually doing something and to arrest low-level targets to convince the American. It's a propaganda machine, like all the rest of them. As the opium began to flow from Turkey, the CIA worked with General Xiang in China's army to create a supplemental drug route, because you can't have too many to poison your people with, that would lead from Burma to Marseille. In 1950, General Chiang's troops had been driven into the state of Burma by the Maoist force of Mao Zedong. And again, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that all of these corrupt CIA implanted people like Chiang here and the ones that were in Bolivia and Chile, we're told that the communist forces of Mao Zedong, and I'm not saying he's a good guy, trust me, but just like with Castro, the mafia had taken over Cuba. They owned everything. They were recruiting young girls into prostitution. They were destroying the country of Cuba. And originally, the people behind Castro's nationalist movement were patriots trying to get the scumbag mafia Americans out of their country. Now, what they do after that's done cannot be condoned. But what who's to say that if the US CIA drug people had not used Havana, Cuba as the drug capital of the Caribbean to infiltrate all of the countries around there with drugs, would you have ever had a Castro? Would you have ever had the need to have a nationalist throw the bums out? Probably not. So inside of China, you have Chiang's military division, and the CIA's bet was that if they could keep them occupied and working for the CIA, they might be able to use them as a front in the Korean conflict to distract China. So they basically are playing all their fields. But their main reason for using him in Burma, which is where he'd been pushed back to, was to run drugs. In 1951, the CIA began supplying arms and material to Chiang forces to help them with opium cultivation. This venture was known as Operation Paper. It became the second example of the CIA conducting off the books foreign policy with assets from which the American people and most elected officials remained completely unaware. The Office of Policy Coordination would grow into the so-called military industrial complex, which would rely on privatized military and intelligence contractors, international bankers, and even Washington's highly organized lobbyists. Now, what's interesting about that is when you go back and you listen to Kennedy's speech, he specifically talks about the Office of Policy Coordination and how it had basically turned into a terrorist organization. So he was absolutely right. The World Commerce Corporation. So finally, while Bill Donovan resigns from the military and goes on to form an organization, a company, a CIA front company called World Commerce Corporation. World Commerce, the World Commerce of Drugs. That's not the name, but that is what it is. With a small group of very wealthy friends, including Nelson Rockefeller, Joseph Grew, nephew of J.P. Morgan, Alfred DuPont, and Charles Jocelyn Hambro of the Hambros Bank. So there's your drug dealers, guys. These people are drug dealers. The firm, which was registered in Panama, employed mob boss Sonny Fusolis, an international arms dealer, to provide services to General Chiang's National Army. So you grow me drugs, I give you weapons. That's the deal. The opium was flown from the mountains of Burma and Laos by civil air transport, which was later Air America, to Bangkok, where the planes were emptied, loaded with weapons, and returned for more drugs. In Bangkok, General Phao, who was the director of Thailand's national police, employed his officers to load the products on freighters of a mysterious shipping company called Sea Supply Inc. which was also a CIA front company ran by Paul Hollywell. And guess where he now worked? He worked at the Burmese consulate in Miami. So, where all of these drugs from Burma to the labs in France to Cuba to Miami. And you got the guy who was part of the whole setting up of all of these stay behind units after the Germans did it initially at the desk of the Burma in Miami to facilitate this in and importing them into the United States. Crazy. In 1954, British customs in Singapore stated that the Bangkok had become the major center of opium trafficking in Southeast Asia. The drug trade became so lucrative that Thailand abandoned the anti-opium campaign it had launched in 1948. So they just threw in the towel, decided they were going to be part of it, and make a lot of money. General Fow developed a close relationship with Wild Bill Donovan, who had been appointed the U.S. ambassador to Thailand. Now, come on, guys. There's no way that the State Department doesn't know all of this is going on when they're appointing the people in the State Department jobs to facilitate it. It's ridiculous. So, Fow, by 1953, had received $35 million in aid from the CIA, including gifts of naval vessels, cargo planes used to transport drugs to Hong Kong, Singapore, and Marseille in France. These were given with the expectation that they would launch for Chiang, launch attacks into China. The WCC, the World Commerce Corporation, and Sea Supply, like the Civil Air Transport, emerged from a subculture within the intel community, CIA, of extremely wealthy and well-connected lawyers, businessmen who at the time were not part of the official government agency. It would give rise to a network of banks like the BCCI, which was established in Pakistan to launder money, because the drug cartel is going to get so big that they have to have their own dedicated bank besides the Castle Bank that's in the Caribbean, who's doing it now. The propriety businesses, including American International Group of CV Star, which were created to support and conceal the flow of money of the heroin trade. So by 1958, the opium trade in Southeast Asia became so brisk that a second drug supply line was established by the CIA. This route ran from a dirt airstrip in Laos to Saigon's airport in southern Vietnam. In addition to the air transport, the CIA contracted services from a small Corsican, French, airplanes for this transport. The Saigon drop would have been impossible without the cooperation of the current president of South Vietnam, Diem, and his brother, who served as his chief advisor. Diem, a devout Roman Catholic, had been instructed by the Pope to cooperate with the strategies of the U.S. government to thwart the gains of Ho Chi Minh and North Korea. The cooperation was deemed so important by the Vatican that Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York formed a pro-Diem lobby in Washington. The Vietnamese independent coalition led by Ho Chi Minh to the God-fearing Diem for salvation. That was the comparison that Spellman made through his PR campaign. Such tactics raised the ire of British writer Graham Greene, himself a devout Catholic, who dispatched the following from Saigon to London Sunday Times. It is Catholicism which has helped ruin the government of Mr. Diem, for his genuine piety has been exploited by the American advisors until the church is in danger of sharing the unpopularity of the United States. That's a big statement. He is telling the people in the West that the people in Vietnam, like they did with the French, view Americans very negatively because of their involvement in the drug trade. As a result, that Dim associating himself with all of the Western Catholic um, people that were being flown over to Vietnam to help with this arrangement, he was being discredited. So when he's eventually overran by his own people, who does he have to blame but the people who he was hanging around with? Again, that's kind of the same thing we were just talking about in all these other countries. And what you see as a result in all of these countries is something that I said earlier. Country after country after country is left in disarray. And what happens? You generate mass migration from those countries into the United States to destabilize the United States. Look at where all of these people that's coming across our border right now are coming from. They are coming from countries that have been grossly destabilized by the CIA. And what better by with these stay behind Operation Gladio units in their countries? If the CIA and this global order international syndicate wants to destroy America and they can't take our guns, can you think of a better way to do it? Destroy our country with drugs, drug addiction. I 100% believe the CIA is in control of every single one of the cartels in Mexico because of all of what they've done here. They control the mafia. You cannot tell me they don't control the cartel. The cartel is the mafia, one and the same. They control it. They are on purpose destabilizing our country because they can't take our guns. Okay. As the Western world becomes increasingly inundated with heroin, the CIA, through spokesmen such as George White of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, placed the blame on Chairman Mao, who were accused of orchestrating the movement of between 200 and 400 tons of opium to Bangkok. Now, I just told you who was doing it. And there's document after document after document in the footnotes of exactly who was doing it. But do you see what our CIA does? Oh, let's blame the communists. You see how the communists are always the problem when the communists was not the problem at all. The agency also presented General Powell the linchpin in the Asian drug connection as America's best hope in combating this drug menace. So the guy who's actually aiding and abetting the drug is the guy that's going to thwart. Such reports represented the first unfurling of a CIA false flag. Knowing the importance of issuing such false reports, the CIA under Allen Dulles initiated Operation Mockingbird in 1953. This operation involved recruiting leading journalists and editors to fabricate stories and create smokescreens in order to cast the agency's agenda in a positive light and blame people who had nothing to do with their crimes, of the crime. William Paley of CBS, Henry Luce of Time Inc., Arthur Schlussberger of the New York Times, Barry Bingham Sr. of the Louisville Carrier, James Copley of Copley Press. Entire news organizations were part of Mockingbird, such as ABC, NBC, Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, Hearst, Scripps Howard, Newsweek, Mutual Broadcasting System, the Miami Herald, the Saturday Evening Post, the New York Herald Tribune. They now had over 400 journalists involved in Operation Mockingbird by 1953. God knows what the number is today. To aid in the process of washing the billions of dollars in heroin trade, the CIA worked in tandem with a Henry Manfredi, who established the first overseas operation in Rome in 1951 of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Manfredi was established close ties with Monsieur Giovanni Battista Montini, then the Vatican Undersecretary of State, and later Pope Paul V. Through Montini, so wait, Montini goes on to be the Pope. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics arranged to divert the flow of cash at first through the Merrill Lynch brokerage house before it finally ended up at the Vatican Bank. The transactions were supervised by Massimo Spada, a senior official at the bank. Spada, who is also a Knight of Malta, chaired and served on the boards of an astonishing array of companies, just like the other guy, including the natural gas company, the insurance company, the credit company, the shipping company, Air Italia, Alfa Romeo, and Italy's telephone system. And also companies that aggregated up to 90% of Italian steel manufacturing. For assistance in managing the billions, Spada turned to tax attorney. I don't know if his name's, it's spelled like Michelle, but I'm going to say it's Michael Sindona, a leading figure of the Sicilian mafia. He originally was a peasant in Patti, Sicily. Sedona earned his degree in tax law from the University of Messina. Following the Allied invasion, he abandoned his practice, and he's the guy that we talked about in the first chapter that became the black market guy that was trading all of the food during the war, and he needed protection in doing it. So through the mafia, Vito Genovese, Sedona was able to get the protection, and he found out about him through his local Catholic Church official. Oh, gosh, crazy. And the bishop used his influence with the Sicilian Dons in the U.S. military to provide Sedona with fresh produce, forged papers, and safe passage through the country. So Sedona was used a portion of his profits to purchase arms for the Allied military government, which he then provided to Salvador Giuliano and other members of the movement for the independence of Sicily. By the end of the war, Sedona had become a respected member of the Luciano Don Carlo crime family and one of the Sicilian mafia's leading financial advisors. Now, what's interesting about this guy is in Whitney Houston's book about Epstein, she actually talks about this guy. I had to go look him up because I'm like, yeah, she identifies this guy. Between 1952 and 1955, he spent a considerable amount of time in New York, New York City, acting as Luciano's emissary to Vito Genovese. By 1955, he had also become a CIA operative, providing a steady flow of black funds to leading Catholic dignitaries, including Giovanni Montini, who was by now appointed Archbishop of Milan. Montini, in turn, introduced the ambitious young lawyer to Massimo Spada. Sedona now formed an integral part of the nexus between the CIA, the mob, and the Vatican, and he would come to play a crucial role in the chain of events that would result in toppling of governments, wholesale slaughter, and the widespread financial devastation. So that's it for today. We've gone through 4 chapters now. The next chapter up is secret societies, and that's a very interesting segment to our book review. So nobody is commenting, unlike yesterday where I had lots of comments. Is anybody watching got any comments for us? The whole purpose of doing this in a live format is to be able to interact with people who may have questions or things that they want further explained. So hopefully, in the upcoming sessions that we will have some people that either want further research into a particular area that we can talk about. But I want to suggest everyone go to the link that's in the live chat and look at the connections that I was able to make in that diagram from chapters 1 and 2. I will this afternoon update it with the people that we just introduced in 3 and 4. So it's going to get a little bit more messy. But I think it's important to capture all of the connections of these people so you can see by looking at that chart who are the catalyst that drove. Everybody asks in all of these forums, who's behind it all? Who's behind it all? This allows us to display unequivocally who's behind it. It will show links, and obviously, people like Wild Bill Donovan was crucial to the establishment of this. And then linking all of the moneyed people, the Rockefellers, the JP Morgans, to the efforts, again, takes us yet another layer behind the curtain. Eventually, what we're going to do is get to that next layer, like the Wallenbergs in Sweden and the Mercedes in Italy, that you don't hear a lot of talk about, but they are the layer behind the layer that's on that chart. And we're building towards that as we do these books. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Stay tuned for the next one.